Maria's day always began before the sun peeked over the horizon. Her alarm would buzz at 4:30 a.m., jolting her awake in the stillness of her modest apartment. As she lay in bed for a moment, gathering the strength to face another grueling day, her thoughts would always drift to her children, still asleep in the room next to hers. The room was small, the walls worn, but it was their sanctuary. She had worked hard to provide this home for them, no matter how humble. She quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake them. They had no idea what their mother endured every day, and Maria preferred it that way. Her two children, Marcus and Lila, were her world, and she was determined to shield them from the hardships that came with their financial struggles. She tiptoed around their small apartment, getting dressed in the dark. There wasn't much to choose from in her wardrobe, just a handful of uniforms and a couple of casual outfits. Her work clothes had seen better days, frayed around the edges from months of constant use. But they were clean, pressed, and ready for another long shift at the hospital. She laced up her worn sneakers, the soles practically smooth from miles of walking. These shoes had carried her through countless miles, and though she felt every crack in the sidewalk and every pebble on the road, she never complained. Maria couldn't afford to replace them, but she knew there were other things her children needed, far more than new shoes for her. Her children always came first. Maria packed a small bag with whatever food she could scrape together for lunch. Usually just a sandwich or an apple, sometimes nothing at all. There wasn't much money left after paying rent and utilities. As she headed for the door, she stole one last glance at Marcus and Lila, their peaceful faces illuminated by the soft light filtering through the curtains. She smiled softly, their presence giving her the strength to step outside and face the journey ahead. The early morning streets were empty, and the air was cool against her skin. It was still dark out, with only the distant hum of traffic and the occasional barking dog breaking the silence. Maria set off, her legs already accustomed to the familiar routine. She had walked this same path for months now, 10 miles to the hospital and 10 miles back home every single day. It wasn't easy, but Maria was no stranger to hard work. Each step she took reminded her of why she did this, to ensure a better future for her kids. They deserved a life without struggle, without fear of eviction notices or overdue bills. She dreamed of Marcus becoming a doctor, or Lila pursuing her love of art. The world had so much to offer, and Maria would do everything in her power to make sure they had access to it, no matter how hard she had to work. As the first rays of sunlight began to break through the clouds, Maria continued her long trek. She passed by neighbors who were just waking up, some offering a polite nod or a smile, others barely noticing her presence. Some days, the journey felt lonelier than others. Despite the people around her, Maria often felt invisible, her struggles unseen by those who were rushing to their own lives. Yet she never asked for help. She didn't want to burden anyone with her problems. This was her life, her choice, and she would carry the weight of it on her own shoulders. On one particularly hot morning, Officer Carter happened to be on his usual patrol when he saw her. He had seen Maria before, of course, walking the same stretch of road, day in and day out. She always seemed focused, determined, her head down and her steps steady. It was as if she had somewhere important to be every single day. At first, Carter hadn't paid much attention. After all, people walked to work all the time. But something about Maria stuck with him. As a police officer, Carter was trained to observe, to notice things most people might overlook. And what he noticed about Maria was how consistent her routine was. Every day at the same time, she was on that road, walking those long miles. At first, he thought maybe she was just someone who enjoyed walking. But after a few weeks of seeing her like clockwork, he began to wonder what her story was. Why was she always walking? Where was she going? And more importantly, why didn't she seem to have a car? One day, Carter decided to investigate a little further. He wasn't trying to be intrusive, but his curiosity had gotten the better of him. There was something about this woman's quiet determination that intrigued him. He began to make a mental note of her routine. He observed how she always left early in the morning, the exact same time every day. He saw her walking past the same landmarks, the gas station, the small park, the grocery store, until she eventually disappeared into the distance. What struck Carter the most was the state of Maria's shoes. He had noticed them from his patrol car one morning, scuffed and worn, the soles barely intact. As she walked, he could see the strain in her steps, the way her body seemed to sag with exhaustion. But still, she kept moving forward. One day, Carter decided to discreetly follow Maria. He wasn't sure what he was looking for or what he expected to find, but something about her resilience tugged at him. He followed from a distance, making sure not to make her uncomfortable or aware of his presence. As he trailed her through the quiet streets, he noticed how she interacted with the world around her. She smiled politely at strangers, gave a small wave to the elderly man who sat on his porch every morning, and continued her journey without complaint. Carter watched as Maria crossed town, her pace steady but unhurried. After about 2 hours of walking, she reached her destination, a local hospital. As she stepped inside, Carter parked his patrol car and followed, keeping his distance. Once inside, he approached the front desk and casually asked about Maria. The receptionist smiled warmly when she spoke about her. Maria was one of the hardest workers they had, she explained. She was always reliable, always on time, despite living so far away. Everyone at the hospital respected her for her dedication, but none of them knew how far she walked each day just to get there. As Carter left the hospital, his mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about Maria's story. She wasn't just a woman walking to work. She was a mother, working tirelessly to provide for her children and walking 20 miles every day because her car had broken down months ago and she couldn't afford to fix it. It was more than just a long commute. It was a testament to her strength and determination. Carter felt an overwhelming sense of empathy. He remembered his own upbringing, the struggles his family had faced, and how hard his mother had worked to keep food on the table. Maria's story hit close to home, and he knew he couldn't just sit by and do nothing. She had carried the weight of her situation for too long. It was time for someone to help lighten the load. Officer Carter couldn't shake Maria's story from his mind. After leaving the hospital that day, he spent the drive back to the station deep in thought. Maria's strength and resilience inspired him, but he also felt a sense of responsibility. It wasn't fair that someone like her, who worked so hard and sacrificed so much, had to bear the burden of her struggles in silence. As he pulled into the station's parking lot, Carter made a decision. he was going to help. At first, Carter wasn't sure where to start. He didn't want to make Maria feel uncomfortable or ashamed by offering help directly. He knew from experience that pride could make accepting assistance difficult, especially for someone as independent as Maria seemed to be. So he decided to approach the situation carefully, without overwhelming her or making her feel like a charity case. His plan began to take shape as he thought about how to rally the community quietly and respectfully. The next day, Carter started making phone calls. He reached out to a local mechanic he had known for years, explaining the situation without naming Maria. The mechanic, Dave, was quick to offer his help. He told Carter that he would be more than happy to fix the car for free, provided they could get it to his shop. He'd seen too many people struggling in similar situations and wanted to do what he could. "You'd be surprised how many people around here are just one car repair away from losing everything," Dave said, his voice filled with understanding. Carter thanked him and promised to be in touch. With that piece of the puzzle in place, Carter moved on to the next step. He stopped by a local shoe store, a small family-owned business that had been in the town for generations. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Green, were known for their generosity and often donated shoes to community members in need. Carter explained Maria's situation, her long walks, and her worn-out shoes. Without hesitation, the Greens offered to provide her with several pairs of sturdy, comfortable shoes. "She's going to need something that can handle all those miles," Mrs. Green said, her eyes softening at the thought of someone walking so far just to make ends meet. Carter smiled, knowing that Maria would appreciate this kindness more than words could express. Next, Carter reached out to a few other local businesses. A grocery store owner agreed to donate some groceries for Maria and her children. A nearby gas station owner offered free fuel vouchers once Maria's car was repaired. Slowly but surely, Carter was building a quiet network of support for Maria, all without her knowing. It wasn't about charity. It was about giving back to someone who had given so much without asking for anything in return. The community response was overwhelming. Word began to spread quietly, and more people wanted to contribute. A local church group gathered funds to help with future repairs or bills Maria might face. Carter made sure everything was done discreetly. He didn't want Maria to feel like the whole town was watching her or pitying her. This was about helping, about lifting someone up who had carried her burdens alone for far too long. As the support continued to grow, Carter couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride in his community. People were stepping up without hesitation, eager to help someone who had become a symbol of quiet perseverance. The outpouring of generosity was a reminder that despite the challenges people face, there is always a desire to do good, to lend a hand when someone is struggling. With everything in place, Carter had to figure out how to present all of this to Maria. He knew she wasn't someone who would easily accept help, especially from strangers. It would take some convincing, and he wanted to make sure she understood that this wasn't charity. This was about people coming together to support one of their own. The next morning, Carter decided to approach Maria after her shift at the hospital. He waited by the entrance, hoping to catch her before she started her long walk home. When she finally emerged, she looked tired but focused, her face a mask of determination. Carter approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her. "Maria," he said softly, stepping forward with a warm smile. She looked up, surprised to see the officer who she'd seen around town. "Officer Carter, right?" she asked, clearly puzzled by his presence. "That's right," he replied. "I was hoping to talk to you for a moment, if you don't mind." Maria hesitated, unsure of what this could be about, but she nodded. "Sure, what's going on?" Carter took a deep breath, knowing this conversation had to be handled delicately. "I've noticed you walking to work every day, and I can't help but admire your dedication. I also understand that your car has been out of commission for a while, and I know how hard that can be." Maria's face tightened slightly, and she shifted uncomfortably. "It's just something I have to deal with," she said, her voice firm. "I'm managing." Carter nodded, fully aware of how difficult it was for someone like Maria to admit she needed help. "I know you're managing," he said gently, "but you don't have to do it all alone." He explained what had been happening behind the scenes. The mechanic willing to fix her car for free, the shoes from the Green family, the groceries that had been donated. As he spoke, Maria's expression shifted from surprise to something closer to disbelief. "Why would they do all this for me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know these people." Carter smiled softly. "Because people see you, Maria. They see how hard you work, how much you sacrifice. And sometimes, when someone like you has been carrying so much weight, it's okay to let others help lighten the load." Maria's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly looked away, trying to maintain her composure. She wasn't used to this, to people offering her help without expecting something in return. For so long, she had been the one keeping everything together, holding her family up through sheer willpower. The idea of accepting help felt foreign, almost wrong. But as she listened to Carter's kind words, she realized something. Maybe she didn't have to do this alone. Maybe it was okay to accept the kindness of others, even if it made her feel vulnerable. It took a moment, but Maria nodded slowly. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "Okay." Carter smiled, relieved and proud of Maria for letting her guard down, even just a little. "We'll get your car to the shop first thing tomorrow," he said. "And in the meantime, we've got some other things lined up to help make life a little easier." Over the next few days, the community support continued to pour in. Maria's car was towed to Dave's garage, where it was promptly repaired. When she saw her car again, clean, fixed, and ready to drive, Maria couldn't believe it. She had forgotten what it felt like to have a little bit of freedom, to not be bound by the long walks and aching feet. The Green family shoes arrived at her door, along with the groceries and fuel vouchers. Each gift was accompanied by a note, offering words of encouragement and support. At first, Maria struggled with the wave of generosity. She wasn't used to being on the receiving end, and the feeling of gratitude mixed with a sense of pride that was hard to let go of. But as she looked around at the kindness of strangers, people who had come together simply because they saw her struggle, something inside her softened. She realized that accepting help didn't make her weak. It didn't take away from her strength or her ability to provide for her children. If anything, it made her stronger, because now she had the support of an entire community behind her. As the days passed, Maria's life began to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. She could drive her children to school again, which saved her hours of walking and gave her more time to spend with them. She no longer had to worry about her shoes falling apart or going without lunch during her shifts. And with each act of kindness, Maria's heart grew a little lighter. But perhaps the biggest change was the shift in Maria herself. She had always been strong, but now she understood the power of community, the power of people coming together to help one another without judgment or expectation. And she vowed, silently but firmly, that she would find a way to pay it forward, to pass on the kindness she had received. The transformation wasn't just in Maria's life, though. The community had come together in a way that went beyond just helping one person. The bonds they formed during this experience became the foundation for something bigger, a spirit of generosity and compassion that began to ripple through the town. As Maria's life slowly began to transform, the impact of the community's generosity spread far beyond just her own household. It wasn't simply the repaired car or the new shoes that changed her circumstances. It was the overwhelming feeling of being seen, valued, and supported by those around her. For so long, Maria had been walking through life with her head down, focused on survival, never expecting anyone to reach out and lend a hand. But now, with the support of people she barely knew, she realized she was not as alone as she had once believed. With her car restored, Maria's daily walk to work was replaced by a smooth, comfortable drive. She no longer had to set out hours before sunrise or return home exhausted, only to collapse into bed after a long day at the hospital. This newfound freedom allowed her to be more present in her children's lives. She could attend Marcus's soccer games and help Lila with her school projects, moments she had missed in the past due to the physical toll of her grueling schedule. But what truly surprised Maria was the way her relationship with her community shifted. She had always kept to herself, partly out of necessity, partly because she assumed others were too busy with their own lives to notice her struggles. Now, however, the outpouring of support had opened doors to connections she had never imagined. Neighbors who had once passed her by with little more than a nod were now stopping to talk, asking how she and her kids were doing. It wasn't pity. They weren't treating her like a charity case. Instead, it was genuine interest, born from the shared sense that they were all part of something bigger, something that brought them together. One evening, a few weeks after receiving the car, Maria was invited to a community gathering. It was a casual get-together at the local park, organized by some of the same people who had helped her. There was food, music, and children running around, laughing and playing. At first, Maria hesitated. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, and she worried that everyone might look at her differently now. But when she arrived with Marcus and Lila, she was greeted not with stares or whispers, but with warm smiles and open arms. People from all walks of life came up to her, introducing themselves and sharing their stories. Some of them had been through tough times themselves and knew what it was like to struggle. Others simply believed in the power of community and wanted to make sure no one was left behind. As Maria sat with her children, watching them laugh with their new friends, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. This was more than just a gathering. It was a testament to what could happen when people cared for one another, when they chose kindness over indifference. During the event, a small group of community leaders approached Maria with an idea they had been discussing. They wanted to create a formal support network in the town, something that could help others who were struggling, just like Maria had been. The initiative, tentatively called Helping Hands, would be a way for people to give back, to lend support to those in need, whether it was a car repair, groceries, or just someone to talk to. Maria was taken aback by the proposal. She had never seen herself as someone who could inspire such change. But as the leaders spoke, she realized that her experience could be the spark for something much larger. She agreed to get involved, not just as a recipient of help, but as someone who could give back. It felt like a full circle moment, where once she had walked alone, now she would walk alongside others, offering them the same support she had received. As Helping Hands began to take shape, Maria found herself at the heart of its mission. She became an advocate for those who had been in her shoes, those who were too proud or too afraid to ask for help. Through the network, the community began identifying other individuals and families who were facing similar struggles. Some had lost jobs, others were dealing with health issues or unexpected financial burdens. With Maria's help, the organization connected these people with resources, often through the same quiet, compassionate approach that had been used to help her. One of the first people to benefit from Helping Hands was a woman named Sandra, a single mother who had been working 2 jobs to support her children after her husband passed away unexpectedly. Like Maria, Sandra was someone who kept her head down and did what she had to do, never asking for assistance despite the challenges she faced. When the team from Helping Hands reached out to her, Sandra was initially reluctant. She had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, but Maria knew that feeling all too well. Maria visited Sandra personally, sharing her own story and explaining how difficult it had been for her to accept help at first. They talked late into the evening, their conversation filled with shared experiences and mutual understanding. By the end of their talk, Sandra agreed to let the community step in. Through Helping Hands, Sandra received financial support to cover some of her overdue bills, as well as help with childcare, so she could focus on her own health and well-being. The impact of this growing network wasn't limited to just a few individuals. As word spread, more people came forward, either seeking help or offering to contribute. Businesses that had once been rivals found common ground in their desire to support the cause. Schools got involved, organizing food drives and clothing donations. What had started as a simple gesture for Maria had blossomed into a movement of kindness and generosity, a wave of compassion that touched every corner of the town. Officer Carter, who had quietly orchestrated the initial effort to help Maria, watched all of this unfold with a deep sense of satisfaction. He had always believed in the power of community, but witnessing the tangible results of their collective effort had exceeded even his expectations. The town had changed, not in some grand, dramatic way, but in the small, everyday actions of its people. It was the way neighbors checked in on each other, the way businesses supported local families, the way children learned to care for those who were struggling. The transformation was subtle, yet profound. Carter often reflected on how different things might have been if he hadn't paid attention that one day when he saw Maria walking to work. He had followed his instinct, not knowing where it would lead, And now he was witnessing the ripple effect of that decision. He no longer saw people like Maria walking alone in the early hours of the morning, their struggles invisible to the world. Instead, he saw a community that had learned to open its eyes, to recognize when someone was in need, and to offer help without hesitation. The creation of Helping Hands marked the beginning of a new chapter for the town. It wasn't just about Maria anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt like they had to carry their burdens in silence. The initiative became a source of hope for those who had lost faith in the idea that anyone would care about their struggles. And as more success stories emerged, people like Sandra and others who had been lifted up by the community's support, the town's spirit of generosity grew even stronger. Maria, for her part, never forgot the journey she had taken. She continued to work at the hospital, but now her life was filled with more than just long hours and exhausting days. She was an active member of Helping Hands, often the first to reach out when someone was in need. She had gone from being a quiet figure, walking the streets alone, to becoming a symbol of resilience and community. Her story was no longer one of struggle, but one of transformation and connection. As the years passed, the town continued to thrive. The culture of kindness that had taken root became a defining feature of the community. It was common to hear stories of neighbors stepping in to help each other, whether it was something as small as a ride to the doctor's office or as significant as helping someone avoid eviction. People no longer looked the other way. When they saw someone struggling, they took action. And all of this had started with a single act of noticing. A police officer, going about his daily routine, had seen a woman walking, and instead of dismissing it, he had followed his instinct to understand her story. That one decision had set off a chain of events that forever changed the lives of not just Maria, but countless others. In the end, Officer Carter often found himself reflecting on how much the town had evolved. He no longer saw solitary figures walking long distances in silence. Now, when he drove through the streets, he saw people walking together, offering rides, or simply stopping to chat. The sense of isolation that had once permeated the town was gone, replaced by a spirit of connection and care. The ripple effect of Maria's journey continued to spread, touching lives in ways that no one could have predicted. And as Carter watched the community he loved become a place where kindness was the norm, he knew that it had all begun with a simple, quiet observation. One small act had led to something extraordinary, reminding everyone that even in the toughest of times, there is always the possibility of change, if only we choose to see it. If you were touched by this story, be sure to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you saw someone like Maria? Let's keep the conversation going and inspire more acts of kindness.